You ever feel like you're just running on a treadmill? You're working harder than ever, but those big life goals like buying a house or actually saving for retirement, they just keep getting further and further away? Well, you are definitely not alone. Today we're going to dig into why that feeling is so common and what exactly happened to that old promise of progress. Let's get into it.
And this, right here, is the central puzzle we're trying to solve. We live in a time with more global wealth than ever before in human history. And yet, for so many people, especially younger folks, financial security feels less like a real possibility and more like a fantasy. So, how can it be that while the world is getting richer, so many of us feel like we're falling behind?
And this really lays out the core conflict, doesn't it? On one side, you have global wealth just skyrocketing. On the other, the basic building blocks of an adult life seem totally out of reach. This isn't just a feeling, it's a fundamental shift in how our economy works. And to really get it, we have to look back at the deal that used to exist between generations. For a long, long time, there was this kind of unspoken agreement, a really simple promise that society basically made to its young people. It was this clear, reliable path forward, a kind of social contract that we call the intergenerational bargain. And the path was pretty straightforward. It looked like this. You work hard, you land a stable job, and that job lets you buy a home. That home then becomes your main asset, right? It's the cornerstone you use to build wealth. And over time, that lets you save, maybe invest, and eventually retire without having to worry. It was the formula for a solid middle-class life. So here's the most important part. The bargain was a promise. A promise that if you played by the rules, if you put in the hard work, you could expect your life to be at least as good as your parents' generation, and probably even a little bit better. But as we're about to see, somewhere along the line, that promise got broken. So what happened? What broke the promise? Well, the first big reason is something we're calling the Great Disconnect. This is where we see this massive shift in how our economies create and, more importantly, distribute wealth. The rules of the game have totally changed.
This quote from our source material just hits the nail on the head. The whole system is now tilted, and it's heavily in favor of people who already own things. Property, stocks, that sort of stuff. Meanwhile, it's gotten so much harder for people who earn their living from a paycheck. Your wealth today is less about how hard you work and more about what you already own. And you can really see the problem in the numbers. Just look at that tall bar on the left. That is the insane growth in the value of housing. Now look at the tiny little bar next to it. That's real wage growth, your salary after you account for inflation. The gap between those two isn't just a gap anymore, it's a chasm.
And to put a real number on it, think about this. A few decades back, the average house cost about 3 times the average annual salary. Today, in a lot of places, that number has jumped over 8 times. That one stat tells you pretty much everything you need to know about how dramatically the goalposts for owning a home have moved.
Okay, so this brings us to the next piece of the puzzle. If you can't rely on your wages to get ahead, how do you even get your foot in the door? Well, for a whole lot of people, the answer is debt. And the role debt plays in our lives has been completely transformed.
It used to be a tool, right? Something you use strategically to invest. But now for millions, debt is the mandatory price of admission. You need it to get an education, just to get a decent job. You need a staggering amount of it to even dream of buying a house. It's not an option anymore, it's a requirement.
So, we've looked at the economic machinery here, assets shooting past wages and debt becoming a necessity. But what does all of this actually mean for real people, in their real lives? What's the human cost when this generational promise just falls apart?
Well, the consequences are direct and they're profound. Homeownership gets pushed back, sometimes forever. Retirement starts to feel like a complete fantasy for anyone who can't manage to build up serious savings, and the fact that it's so hard to build that wealth in the first place, that just widens the gap between the haves and the have-nots, and it fuels this incredible level of wealth inequality.
And this really sums up the 2 different economic worlds people are living in. For asset owners, people who are often from older generations, wealth just grew on its own as their assets inflated. For younger workers, their main engine, their wages, has stalled. The path to owning a home used to be accessible, now there's a huge barrier to entry. And debt? It's gone from being a useful tool to a heavy, lifelong burden.
So, this is the challenge we're facing. The old promise that hard work leads to a better life is broken. The path that our parents and grandparents followed just isn't there for a lot of us anymore, which leaves us with a huge, important question. If the old bargain is broken, what's the new one going to be?